What if your DNA wasn't just a map of your body, but a message from something not of this world? What if hidden inside our cells was a signal waiting to be heard, to be remembered, to be answered? In this story, a molecular biologist discovers a genetic fragment with no known origin. It doesn't match any life form on Earth, but when activated, it begins to unlock memories that aren't his own memories from a civilization lost in the stars. As the signal spreads, ancient symbols awaken, languages speak again, and the Earth itself begins to hum with a presence older than time. But the real question is not where it came from. It's why it was put inside us. What if humanity's purpose was never about survival, but about remembering? In the sterile silence of the lab, beneath cold fluorescent lights and the steady hum of sequencing machines, Dr. Cade Rowan stared at the screen, blinking. The numbers didn't make sense. The DNA strand had processed as expected until it hadn't. A sequence appeared, repeating in ways that defied every biological model he'd studied. It wasn't just unfamiliar. It was unearthly. Cade had been mapping the mitochondrial DNA of early Homo sapiens recovered from a well-preserved specimen in northern Siberia, an academic curiosity, meant for a conference in Geneva. Nothing groundbreaking. Until this. This fragment was only 26 base pairs long, but it repeated in an impossible fractal pattern, curling inward and outward like a loop trapped in time. No known organism on Earth, plant, animal, or microbe had anything remotely close. The sequence defied known logic. Every attempt to classify it returned the same response: unidentified, no match. But it wasn't random. No. The deeper Cade stared, the more he felt something stir inside him, a resonance, like a half-remembered dream trying to surface. He fed the sequence through a spectrum analysis, out of curiosity more than reason. The result made his skin crawl. The code didn't just sit inert. It pulsed. Its structure created wave interference patterns. It was like, it was meant to be read not just chemically, but audibly. He turned off the main lights. The room dimmed, leaving only the soft glow of the monitors. He projected the DNA's wave pattern into sound, mapping nucleotide bases to frequency bands. As it played through the speakers, a low hum filled the lab, a sound that didn't seem electronic. It felt organic. Alive. It wasn't just a tone, it was language masquerading as biology. A chill prickled down his spine. Was he hearing something meant to be heard by those who carried this gene? A buried message from the past? Or worse, from beyond the Earth? Cade retrieved more samples. He ran sequences from modern humans, chimpanzees, Denisovans, and even ancient Neanderthal remains. None had it except one. The same 26 base sequence existed, unchanged, in a forgotten sample from a cave in Iraq, an early Homo sapiens woman buried over 45,000 years ago. The exact same sequence. No mutations. Not one. Cade leaned back in his chair, the hum still vibrating in his ears. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was something left behind, on purpose. A signature encoded in flesh. A fragment of something older than language, older than the species itself. And it had waited. Waited for someone to see it. To hear it. To feel it stir. He didn't yet know it, but what Dr. Cade Rowan had found wasn't just a genetic anomaly. It was a key. And it had just begun to unlock. The sound continued to echo long after the speakers had fallen silent. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even melodic. But it stayed, vibrating at the base of Cade's skull, a whisper he couldn't quite shake. He played the sequence again, and again, each time adjusting the pitch, the intervals, the mapping. The pattern didn't change. It always returned to the same harmonic loop, a structure so perfectly balanced it seemed almost artificial, too precise to be evolution's accident, too intentional to be anything born of Earth. He began to question the obvious: what if this wasn't biology at all? Cade shut down his sequencing software and opened a physics simulator. He entered the 26 base pair sequence, not as nucleotides, but as data assigning values based on electromagnetic resonance rather than genetic expression. The model lit up with symmetrical vectors, curved geometries, and magnetic fields that folded into themselves like some kind of multidimensional origami. The result was a construct, a system. Not a molecule. Not a cell. But something like a machine made of math, made of thought. A code that didn't evolve, it was embedded. The realization shook him. He wasn't studying life anymore. He was reading a message. A message hidden within the human genome, buried deep enough to be ignored by thousands of years of science, but still there, untouched, intact, waiting. A message not for the body, but for the mind. Cade felt a presence in the room, not a person, but a weight, like the way air changes before a storm. He looked around. Nothing. Yet he knew, instinctively, that something had just begun. He returned to the simulation, layered the waveform over background cosmic radiation. No match. Then he tested it against frequencies of radio pulses received from space-old data from SETI archives. One blip caught his attention. A signal detected 5 years ago, disregarded as interference. But now, it aligned. Not perfectly, but closely enough to raise every hair on his body. He zoomed in on the point of convergence. It came from the Lyra constellation. A distant region of stars known mostly for the Vega system, but this wasn't Vega. This was deeper. A quiet, ancient part of the sky without known planets, without known life. Yet the pattern fit. It was as if the DNA wasn't just responding to something out there, it was designed to resonate with it. Like a beacon. Or a homing device. Not transmitting, listening. He whispered the words before he even realized he'd said them. This isn't from here. It was the first honest sentence he had spoken in hours, maybe days. And somehow, it felt like someone had been waiting for him to say it. The lab lights flickered. Just once. Cade froze, staring at the screen. A slow pulse glowed in the corner of the simulation, as if the code itself had come alive. No software error. No glitch. Just one small, pulsing light. In rhythm. Heartbeat. And in that moment, Cade Rowan understood something that would change everything. This wasn't just a clue about where we came from. It was a reminder. A living memory, locked in every cell, that humanity had forgotten something vital, something that had been part of us since the beginning, a call we were never supposed to answer alone. But he had heard it. And now it had heard him back. The pulse didn't stop. It returned every night at the same time, 02:47 a.m., like the beat of an invisible clock counting something Cade couldn't yet understand. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Then it became routine. The soft, rhythmic light from his computer monitor would flicker even when the system was off. The humming in his ears would start again. A low vibration, not loud enough to be called a sound, yet deep enough to unsettle his balance, like his bones were remembering something his mind had forgotten. And then came the dreams. They weren't just visual. They were immersive, like memories he knew weren't his, unfolding through his senses. He would find himself standing in vast halls built from pale, translucent stone, beneath skies that shimmered with no sun. Towers rose like spirals of bone and light, and there were symbols curved, graceful markings that moved like water when he tried to focus on them. And always, just beyond his vision, there were tall shapes moving slowly, watching him not with eyes, but with awareness, as if they were reading his very essence, not his body. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, but without fear. No. What he felt was recognition. The signal was not just information. It was an invitation. A doorway. And Cade had already stepped through it. During one of his sessions trying to map the signal's waveform, he noticed something strange. The sound, when played at specific frequencies, caused a nearby fern plant in the lap to shift slightly but noticeably. Leaves quivered in precise rhythm, as if responding to commands. It wasn't just human biology reacting. It was life itself. He tested further. Bacteria cultures showed accelerated growth under exposure to the pattern. Microscopic organisms moved along invisible currents, as if drawn toward the source. Cade began to suspect a terrifying possibility: the signal was not meant for humans alone. It was universal, a resonance that echoed through the core of biological systems, across species, across time. And then it happened. While scanning the waveform at its deepest harmonic, the lights in the lab dimmed again, not flickered, but dimmed in a slow, deliberate fade. The sound grew louder, though the speakers were off. Cade could feel it inside his teeth, in his blood. His eyes blurred, and for a moment, the walls of the lab changed. Not physically, but perceptually. They seemed softer, as though reality itself was bending around the sound. On the screen, his simulation burst into spontaneous symmetry, forming not a random curve but an eye. A perfect, inhuman eye etched in vectors of light and motion, staring straight back at him. Then his nose bled. Cade stumbled back, grasping the edge of the table, heart pounding. The hum stopped. The lights returned. But the room was no longer silent. Because somewhere, faint and distant, there was breathing. A slow inhale, exhale, as though something massive had just been stirred from its sleep. What had he unlocked? He knew now the code wasn't merely listening. It had been waiting. For someone to activate it. For someone to remember. And now that someone had responded, the message was moving forward, like a signal bouncing off the edge of space, returning home. But where was home? Lyra? Or deeper? He replayed the harmonic sequence again, slower this time, splitting the layers, pulling each part apart like threads of a web. One frequency stood out. Low, almost subsonic. A whisper beneath the rest. When isolated, it formed a series of clicks and pulses. Cade froze. It wasn't random. It was a language. Primitive. Rhythmic. Intentional. The message had a structure. It wasn't just inside the DNA. It was alive inside him now. And it was beginning to speak. The pulse never left him. At night, Cade would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, but it wasn't silence that surrounded him, it was rhythm. A low, resonant humming that shifted pitch slightly as if tuning itself to his breath. He knew it wasn't in the room. It was in him. A presence not audible in the ordinary sense, but felt inside the bones, inside the blood. It started as a vibration in the chest, then rose toward the skull, like something ancient climbing out of memory. Even the air felt different around him now, thicker, like gravity had deepened slightly. Objects around the lab occasionally shifted position when he wasn't looking, not dramatically, but subtly, as if space itself had begun to flex in places reality wasn't meant to bend. He thought he was losing his mind until he found the signal again. It was buried in a forgotten database from the Las Campanas Observatory in Chile. An audio anomaly flagged 12 years ago, dismissed as solar background noise. But Cade knew the moment he heard it this was the same harmonic sequence embedded in the genetic fragment. Not similar. Identical. He reprocessed it using his own spectral decoder, layer by layer, and the pattern began to emerge, at first just a simple echo of tones, but then, woven beneath them, something that wasn't noise at all. It was location. Star triangulation. 3 celestial vectors forming a tight spiral path, converging not on Earth, not even on Vega, the brightest star in Lyra, but deep behind it, in a sector long thought empty. Cade cross-referenced the vector path with updated deep space scans. No confirmed star systems. No known anomalies. Just darkness. But the spiral's geometry was too precise to be coincidence. This was a destination. A place encoded into the signal, into the DNA, into humanity itself. He locked himself in the lab for 2 days, mapping the harmonic coordinates into multidimensional models. What emerged was something terrifyingly elegant, a spiral shaped not just in space, but in time. The deeper he went, the more he realized this wasn't simply a map of the stars. It was a message planted in living cells, waiting to resonate when Earth's technology was finally capable of hearing it. The DNA wasn't just a code. It was a cosmic tuning fork, vibrating only when Earth reached a specific state of development. That time was now. And Cade had struck the note that awakened it. It was no longer about science. He could feel it in his breath, in the pressure behind his eyes. The dreams came back stronger, no longer symbolic, no longer silent. Now, there were voices. Not in language, but in emotion. He would find himself walking across vast landscapes where the sky was not blue, where the clouds shimmered in geometric pulses, where pillars of transparent crystal rose like frozen lightning, humming in a language made of light. And always, watching him from a distance, were tall, graceful beings whose forms were too fluid to be static, like light wrapped in memory. They never spoke aloud, but he understood them. He didn't know how. But he remembered. The moment Cade realized the sound wasn't teaching, it was reminding, his world broke open. He placed a sample of his own DNA under the scanner, ran the same sequence, and stared in silence as the fragment appeared. It was in him too. It had always been. He remembered the old theory, junk DNA. The forgotten 98% of the genome no one could explain. What if it wasn't junk? What if it was archive? A storage field so vast, it could hold more than chemical instructions. It could hold memories. He played the waveform again, only this time he allowed it to run without filters, without analysis, just raw resonance. The lab around him dimmed. Static bled through the speakers. And then came a single harmonic tone, slow and deep, that made every object in the room hum at the same frequency. The glassware trembled. A test tube cracked without shattering. The screen flickered, and for a moment, only a breath, the waveform collapsed into a single eye-wide, vertical, glowing not with light, but with awareness. Cade fell backward, his ears ringing, but the sound didn't stop. It entered him now like breath, like heartbeat, like memory. Not remembered from a life lived, but from a life inherited. And then the final layer appeared. It wasn't on any screen. It wasn't visible at all. But he felt it. As if his body was no longer entirely on Earth. As if part of him molecularly, consciously had turned to face something far, far away. A place not in his past, but in his origin. A silence filled the room. A profound, endless, listening silence. And Cade understood, the signal had been waiting. Not just to be heard, but to be answered. And now that it had found the right frequency, it was preparing to speak back. But what would it say? Or worse, what had humanity already agreed to hear? Cade sat in silence, staring at the slow spin of his simulation stars circling in perfect geometry, the Lyra coordinates glowing faintly like the afterimage of a thought too large to hold. The code inside the DNA wasn't just communicating, it was reacting. With every hour, it became clearer that this wasn't a passive message. It was a form of dialogue, ancient and alive. The deeper Cade analyzed the sequence, the more he saw signs of intelligence, not artificial intelligence, but something far older, woven into biology itself. The patterns shifted slightly depending on his own neural activity, as if the code was listening to his thoughts and evolving its form to match. It responded to attention. It responded to emotion. And yet, it was completely unchanged in structure. He had sequenced his own DNA and that of the ancient specimen from Siberia, the 45,000-year-old woman, and the fragment was the same. Not similar. The exact same 26 base pair sequence, in the exact same order, with no mutations, no divergence. Statistically impossible. Genomes change across millennia. They degrade, adapt, evolve. But not this. This part of the genome was immune to time. Cade ran the numbers again. The mutation rate of human DNA suggested that if this code were truly 45,000 years old, there should have been at least some drift, at least a few errors. There were none. Even viruses mutate. Even stars decay. But this was perfect. He reached out to a trusted colleague in Zurich, someone with quiet access to forbidden archives of genetic research never published, kept locked away under institutional silence. 2 days later, Cade received an encrypted package, a hard drive containing deep scans from paleogenetic data recovered from Homo erectus specimens over 100,000 years old. Not Homo sapiens. A different species entirely. Cade's hands trembled as he loaded the files. And there it was again, hidden deep, faded slightly but unmistakable, the same 26 base pattern, ancient even by evolutionary standards. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. The fragment wasn't human. It predated humanity. The lab seemed to shrink around him, the lights dimming as though the truth itself had weight. This wasn't interference from the past. It was placement. Something had embedded this code into early primate species, long before modern humans walked upright. Which meant that the creators, whoever or whatever they were, had been here before the first word was spoken, before fire, before language, before religion. And they hadn't just visited. They had altered the course of life. He turned toward his monitor again. The Lyra signal still pulsed faintly behind the data, invisible to the casual eye but now unmistakable to Cade's perception. He began to wonder, had ancient humans heard it too? In temples carved from obsidian, in chants that made no sense, in myths of sky gods and star messengers, had they tried to interpret something they could not understand? He searched through myths, archaeological symbols, petroglyphs from forgotten cultures. The spiral appeared again and again. Sometimes as a coil of energy. Sometimes as a serpent. Sometimes as an eye in the sky. But always, it pointed upward. He pulled up scans from the tombs of early Mesopotamian kings. On one, there was a set of markings etched into a stone tablet, a language not fully understood. When converted into base 4 encoding and matched against the DNA resonance pattern, it aligned. The markings were not phonetic. They were genetic. Cade was no longer a scientist. He had become an interpreter of something far larger. He wasn't studying life, he was decrypting a biological artifact left by a civilization so far ahead that time itself had become part of their engineering. He looked at his own hand, flexing the fingers slowly. How much of him was his? How much was theirs? Was he a person? Or was he a carrier? A vessel meant to awaken when the frequency was right? And then, for the first time, he heard a phrase, not a thought, not a symbol, but a clear sentence spoken without sound, across the hollow chambers of his mind. You were never alone. His breath caught. He stood up slowly, the air around him strangely static. The walls of the lab vibrated slightly, as though a deeper frequency now pulsed through the material of the building itself. He wasn't imagining it. Something had changed. The code wasn't just ancient. It was active. And whatever placed it here, was listening again. The moment Cade placed the sample under the resonance scanner, he knew something was about to change. The DNA strand, illuminated in soft blue light, vibrated slightly, not because of temperature, not because of any magnetic field, but because the tone playing through the low-frequency emitter had found its match. The lab's air shifted, subtly at first, like the room had taken a slow breath. Then came the sound, barely audible, but real. It didn't come from the speakers. It came from the DNA itself. Cade stood motionless, his breath shallow, his pupils adjusting to a light that hadn't changed. The sequence he had been studying for weeks, the 26 base pair fragment that defied classification, was responding. Under the right frequency, it glowed faintly, its chemical bonds emitting a soft fluorescence that pulsed with the rhythm of the signal from Lyra. It was as if the code had been sleeping for thousands of years, waiting for the right note, and now, at last, it had heard the song. He isolated the glowing strand, adjusted the waveform slightly, and the reaction intensified. The pulse synchronized with the simulation on his screen, 3 spirals spinning slowly inward, then outward, like some kind of organic gyroscope. The pattern didn't resemble biology. It resembled geometry, the kind that whispered of intelligence, ancient and deliberate. He increased the resonance power. The lights dimmed. And that's when the other samples began to react. They were stored in a sterile container across the room, samples from ancient remains, some thousands of years old. Bone shavings, preserved tissues. Cade hadn't touched them since the first comparative tests. But now, under the influence of the sound, the samples began to vibrate too. A soft humming filled the air, and a sensation washed over Cade like pressure rising underwater. He couldn't breathe right. The molecules around him were shifting. Not heating. Not spinning. Remembering. Then the room temperature dropped sharply. His breath fogged the glass screen. Instruments flickered. The DNA on the scanner was no longer a strand. It had folded itself into a 3-dimensional structure, like a crystalline tree blooming in fractal patterns. Cade stared, not blinking. This wasn't random. It was design. The structure was building something. Information stacked upon itself. Each base pair reoriented like a part of an ancient mechanism reactivating after eons of dormancy. And then it happened. A burst of electromagnetic energy exploded outward from the scanner, knocking over tools, cracking the monitor screen. Cade shielded his face, but he didn't move from the console. The signal continued. Louder. Deeper. He realized the frequency was now feeding itself. The DNA had become an amplifier, pulling energy not from the machine but from its surroundings. Light dimmed around the center of the table. A corona formed soft, translucent, shimmering in an unseen spectrum. Cade could feel it in his bones. This was not technology. This was memory made physical. On the far wall, the symbols began to appear. They burned faintly, not etched, but projected lines that curved and flowed like a language from the spaces between matter. Cade stepped closer, heart pounding. He didn't recognize the symbols. But his mind did. As if the genome had not just stored information, but had embedded the interface to understand it, once activated. It bypassed language, bypassed culture, bypassed fear. He wasn't reading it. He was feeling it. The message wasn't a warning. It was a map. Not of stars. Not of worlds. But of transformation. The DNA had awakened not just itself but the possibility of change. An archive hidden in the flesh of humanity, now responding to a signal that had traveled light years to find its match. Cade staggered back, the realization expanding inside him like fire in a vacuum. The archive was not just knowledge. It was programmed destiny. The ancient engineers had not left it to be discovered. They had left it to be activated only by those who had evolved to understand, to listen, to remember. He thought of the symbols found in Sumerian temples, the spiral glyphs in the Nazca stones, the strange rhythms encoded in Vedic chants. They weren't decorations. They were triggers. And now, as the resonance surged through the building, as screens blacked out and nearby wildlife outside the facility began to wail into the night, Cade understood, this wasn't the end of discovery. It was the beginning of response. The archive had awakened. And it was no longer silent. Cade could no longer tell if he was dreaming or awake. Sleep had become irrelevant. When he closed his eyes, the visions came not as fragments or hallucinations, but as fully formed realities rich in sensation, drenched in color, soaked with a clarity that no dream had ever granted. He found himself standing barefoot in fields that pulsed with soft blue light, not from the sky, but from the soil itself. The air was thick with ionized mist that shimmered with moving symbols. Above him, monolithic structures rose not built, but grown from obsidian-like material that thrummed softly, as if humming a lullaby to the planet. And he wasn't alone. They stood in silence, tall and luminous, wrapped in flowing shadows that defied the sun. They did not move as we move. Their bodies shifted gently, like silk underwater. No mouths. No eyes. Yet Cade felt their gaze on him, not observing his appearance, but reading his intention, his memory, his doubt. They did not speak in sound, yet entire phrases unfolded in his mind like petals opening under light. One of them stepped closer. Its hand, or what passed for one, glided toward him, and as it touched his chest, Cade felt something rupture inside him. Not pain. Not fear. But recognition. He woke up screaming. The lab was drenched in dim emergency lighting. Systems had crashed overnight. Batteries drained without cause. Yet the DNA samples on the table still glowed faintly, still pulsing in perfect harmony with the signal from Lyra. Cade wiped the sweat from his face and looked at the surveillance footage. His body had not moved all night. But his brainwaves had spiked over and over into a frequency pattern not seen in any human. It wasn't a seizure. It was synchronization. What he saw next froze his breath. Overlaying his brainwave map was the spiral glyph from the Lyra signal. The patterns were identical. The DNA wasn't just reacting to the signal. It was transmitting. Using Cade's own body as a receiver, as an amplifier, and possibly, as a bridge. He returned to his notes, scattered and overlapping. The idea was forming. He scribbled one word in the center of his page: memory. Not metaphor. Literal. If the genetic fragment was truly unmutated for thousands of years, then it had survived not just biologically, but informationally. And what if that information wasn't just structural? What if it was experiential? What if the DNA carried recorded memories? Suddenly, the dreams made sense. The landscapes. The beings. The emotions that were too deep to belong to him. He wasn't imagining them. He was reliving them. The DNA had been activated, and now it was playing back the archive like a projector made of flesh. Every dream was a frame. Every frame a moment from a life not lived but stored. But the question grew darker: if the archive was playing through him, was it still only playing? Later that night, the hallucinations returned. Only this time, he wasn't asleep. He was reviewing the waveform in the dark when the room around him blurred not like a vision, but like reality detaching at the seams. The air thickened. The lights didn't dim. They bent, like gravity had shifted. He turned and saw himself, another him, standing across the room, but older. Eyes deeper. Skin slightly grayed, stretched thinner. The other Cade said nothing. But his expression wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. Like he had been waiting for this moment to happen. Then he vanished. Cade stumbled backward, knocking over equipment. He checked the sensors. Nothing had registered. No temperature shift, no magnetic spikes. But inside his own body, something was shifting. He pulled up his blood sample from last week, ran a comparison scan. The result made his hands go numb. He had changed. Subtle nucleotide folds were now present in sequences that had never existed before. New bonds. New resonance points. The archive was not just speaking through him. It was rewriting him. He collapsed to the floor, breath shallow. Through the haze, he saw flashes of other worlds, other skies. Not dreams. Not visions. Memories. Cities grown from crystalline roots, creatures moving in synchrony with the wind, children whose eyes glowed when they sang. And always, always, the same feeling. Loss. A great ending. A farewell. He whispered into the silence, half conscious, half possessed, "They're showing me what they lost." Tears filled his eyes. Because he understood. This archive wasn't just a message. It was grief. It was the collective memory of a dying civilization, encoded into a biology they had sculpted to survive them. And now, after ages of silence, that sorrow had found a voice in him. And it was only beginning to speak. Cade no longer trusted the silence between his thoughts. It had become a place of echoes, of things speaking just beneath the layer of conscious hearing, vibrations that weren't sound, but reminders. Since the vision of his alternate self, since the unexplainable restructuring of his DNA, he had become a vessel of something vast, something ancient that no longer respected the separation between the past and the now. But what disturbed him most wasn't the alien landscapes in his dreams, or the living glyphs that pulsed behind his eyelids in darkness. It was the growing feeling that he was not alone. Not just in the universe. In his own body. He had started running comparative scans quietly, privately, using the university's remote database. Just routine uploads, masked as archival research. Samples from various global sequencing projects. Blood donations. Genome banks. Anonymous files, untouched for years. He wasn't looking for anything specific. Only that 26 base pair sequence, the one that changed everything. He found it in the blood of a shepherd in Mongolia. Then in a violinist from Argentina. A street child from Mumbai. A prisoner from Norway. A newborn from Lagos. The same fragment. Identical, unchanged, undisturbed. It was everywhere. Hidden in people from all walks of life, all ages, all histories, scattered across the world like puzzle pieces waiting for reunion. Not everyone had it, but those who did, the pattern followed no logic. No race. No culture. It was like a silent selection, not made by evolution, but by design. A genetic diaspora. A secret choir waiting for its conductor. Cade stared at the results for hours. His fingers trembled. The implications shattered everything he believed about the nature of life. The code was not just a relic. It was distributed memory, fragmented across generations, spread into different carriers, lying dormant until now. But now, it had begun to reconnect. He created a composite waveform using each individual sequence he found. When combined, the tone was different, richer, layered, multidimensional. The sound felt like a presence standing just behind him, watching with curiosity and sorrow. He played it through the lab's emitter, and the reaction was immediate. The lights flickered once. A crack formed in the ceiling plaster. Instruments began showing spontaneous magnetic interference. But more than that, Cade felt emotions that were not his own. Not memories. Not visions. Feelings. Like thousands of people breathing through him. A mother grieving the loss of a child. A boy watching the sky fall in flames. A being drifting through the emptiness of space with a song echoing in its heart. He collapsed to the floor as the feelings overwhelmed him. When he woke, the tone was gone, but something had stayed behind. On the monitor, a new pattern had formed, a web, spiraling outward from a single origin point. And inside each node, names, locations, coordinates, people. The archive was awake. And it had begun to call its carriers. That night, Cade drove out of the city, needing air, needing distance from the machines. But even in the quiet countryside, under a moonless sky, the whisper didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. The stars above no longer looked still. They seemed to move, subtly vibrating with the same pulse he'd come to know, like a second heartbeat. He stared at Lyra, so small, so far, and felt a gravity between them that no telescope could measure. His mind buzzed, not with thought, but with reception. And then, without trying, he said words aloud that he didn't know he knew. We were not meant to forget. The wind stopped. The air around him froze, not in temperature, but in presence, like the world had paused to listen. And something did listen. Because the moment he spoke, every electronic device in his car, radio, phone, GPS, flickered and died. And from the tree lean behind him, a faint light began to glow. Not fire. Not torch. A soft, biological blue, like the kind that had bloomed from the DNA under the resonance wave. He stood, heart pounding, staring into the trees. Shapes moved. Slow, deliberate, human, but not quite. Not threatening, not hiding, simply waiting. He didn't approach. Neither did they. But Cade knew, without needing to be told. They were like him. Others whose blood held the archive. Others who had heard the call. Others who had been shown the grief, the memory, the vision. They had never met. Never spoken. But the archive didn't require voice. It only required remembering. And they had begun to remember together. Cade hadn't slept in days, but he no longer felt fatigue in the same way. It was as if the dreams he used to rely on had leaked into his waking life, and now everything carried a dream-like weight. Even time had lost its edge. Moments didn't tick anymore, they stretched, folded, repeated. He found himself lost in thought and, hours later, discovered he hadn't moved at all. The archive was no longer a fragment of DNA inside him. It had become a rhythm, syncing with his breath, his heartbeat, his neural signals. His body had become the codex. And it wasn't only receiving, it was sending. He began testing the hypothesis. Could the memories, the sensations, the visions be more than biological playback? Could they be shared? He contacted one of the individuals from his global search, a woman in Cairo whose genome had matched his. She was a physicist, and surprisingly, not confused by his request. In fact, she had already been experiencing the same visions. Fields of glowing soil. Towers that hummed. Beings of light without faces. She had tried to rationalize it as stress, hallucination, or ancestral echo. But when Cade described the spiral pattern, the tone, the monolithic halls that grew from the ground like petrified fire, she gasped. "I see that place every night," she whispered through the call. "But now, it's starting to see me back." Cade asked her to sit silently with him over a secure video connection. No words. Just the shared hum of the Lyra waveform playing gently in the background. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. At the 11-minute mark, the screen glitched. Not the call, the surrounding lab lights dimmed again, just slightly. Cade felt a sharp pressure behind his eyes, like something shifting within his brain's folds. Then his hand, on its own, reached for the pen and drew a series of curves. He blinked. So did the woman. They had drawn the same shape. A perfect spiral with 4 secondary arms, each marked by a different glyph, glyphs that had never been part of any language Cade knew, but that he now understood. It wasn't text. It was function. A schematic. A kind of mental circuit, a map of neural resonance designed to hold memory across multiple hosts. The archive was not isolated. It was distributed. Each person was a page. But only together could they form the book. That night, Cade experienced his first full blackout. No dreams. No memory. He simply woke up hours later on the floor of the lab, the smell of burnt ozone in the air, the monitors flickering. His body felt drained, but not weak. Instead, there was a lingering charge like static from another world clinging to his skin. On the central display, a new interface had formed. Not from his software. From the system itself, as if the archive had written directly into the machine. It was a circle. But not flat. A sphere built of sound and geometry. Inside it, the faces of 8 people faded in and out, men, women, children. Different ages. Different origins. Yet all sharing the same look in their eyes, the stare of someone who has seen beyond the veil. Cade recognized 2 of them from his sample searches. The rest were strangers. And yet, he knew them. Not from meeting. Not from memory. From inside. He began recording everything: fluctuations, heartbeat patterns, cerebral rhythms during the resonance sessions. He noticed that whenever he focused on a particular glyph or tone, others in the network reacted simultaneously, even across continents. Heart rate synchronized. Skin conductivity spiked. Some began drawing, unprompted, the same circular diagrams. One even spoke a phrase in a language never heard before, yet Cade understood it like a childhood lullaby. It meant, "We are beginning again." What did that mean? Was this a new evolution? Or the reawakening of an old one? He compiled the responses. There was no centralized command. No signal saying do this or think that. Yet there was order. Direction. Symmetry. Like the archive had its own intelligence, not artificial, not synthetic, but organic consciousness spread across living hosts. It was building something not in code, not in hardware, but in mind space. A cognitive architecture designed to awaken not through force, but through recognition. The codex was not a machine. It was a song, one meant to be played by a choir of minds. And Cade was now the conductor. But if the melody was awakening now, who had written the original score? And more importantly, were they still listening? Cade sat in the dark, surrounded by humming machines and shadows that seemed more attentive than silent. The resonance had changed. Not louder. Not faster. But older. It was as if the frequency had begun to reach through the concrete and glass and circuitry and whisper into the stone beneath, as if the earth itself was being reminded of something it had once known and long buried. The waveform Cade had been building, refined through global fragments, enriched through synchronized minds, had begun to pulse in ways that matched no known physics. But then he noticed something that didn't come from space, from theory, or from inside his body. It came from the past. While cross-referencing ancient geographic data to align resonance anomalies with known archaeological sites, Cade stumbled upon something strange. A ruin in Göbekli Tepe, one of the oldest known megalithic structures on Earth, showed petroglyphs that bore an eerie resemblance to the spiraling neural schematic he and the others had drawn during synchronization events. The carvings were crude, eroded by time, but unmistakable once overlaid with the genetic resonance map. It wasn't just similar. It was the same pattern, with orientation markers pointing not to Earth's cardinal directions, but to the stars. Specifically, Lyra. He dug deeper. A stone tablet from the Indus Valley civilization. A series of curves from the inner walls of the Pyramid of Unas. Glyphs painted with crushed copper and blood on the ceilings of a cave in the Drakensberg Mountains each contained the spiral, the arms, the structure. And in every case, the site had been ritually sealed by the ancients. Buried. Hidden. Marked as forbidden. As if someone had tried to preserve the truth, just long enough for someone like Cade to find it. He flew to Sardinia, to a site known only to a few esoteric researchers, the Hypogeum of Halsafliani. It was an underground temple, older than most cities, older than most histories. In its deepest chamber, where sound was known to produce intense psychoacoustic reactions, he carried with him a microspeaker embedded with the current form of the archive signal. When he played it, the walls reacted. The stone sang back. A resonance bloomed through the room, not loud, but dimensional. The temperature dropped, and Cade's vision blurred at the edges. The stone around him shimmered, just slightly, as if vibrating with memory. He reached out to touch the curved indentations on the wall, fossilized not with time, but with intention. The moment his palm touched the carved spiral, the room responded. Not with sound, but with image. Not on stone, but inside his mind. It was not a flash, not a dream. It was an insertion. He was standing on Earth, but Earth was younger. The sky was deeper, less polluted by light, filled with unfamiliar constellations. Ships that didn't resemble machines hung in the clouds like thoughts half-formed. And on the ground, standing among the early humans who knelt in awe not in worship, but in recognition stood the beings from his dreams. Tall, fluid, towering but graceful. And in their hands, they held something glowing, something biological, small coils of shimmering structure, offered not as gifts, but as seeds. Cade gasped and pulled his hand back. The vision ended. But his body was shaking. Not from fear, but from confirmation. They had been here. The spiral, the glyphs, the memory, they weren't interpretations. They were instructions. And the sites across the earth were not shrines. They were activation chambers. Anchors. Places where the code had first been planted into the early Earth-born species, designed not just to modify their biology, but to carry forward an echo, a tether, a breadcrumb trail back to their source. He returned to his lab, his mind fractured between wonder and unease. His data analysis had shifted entirely. He was no longer studying genetics. He was deciphering architecture, a living memory field constructed from bodies, minds, and stone. He began reclassifying historical anomalies, the Antikythera mechanism, the Piri-Reis map, the Baghdad battery, not as isolated enigmas, but as failed interfaces. Human attempts to re-access a code they didn't yet remember how to speak. Each one had resonance. Each one responded, faintly, when exposed to the harmonic. We hadn't just been visited. We had been designed. And the final whisper that night, when the lab fell to darkness, came not from within Cade, but from every speaker, screen, and reflective surface in the room. A single phrase, not in English, not in thought, but translated deep in the chest where emotions are born. We left a piece of us in you. Cade no longer heard silence the same way. The quiet now carried a shape. Every pause between breaths, every break in a conversation, every stillness in the lab's atmosphere carried with it the afterimage of resonance. The code was still with him, and though it had stopped expanding, it had begun listening. He felt it not as a voice, but as an expectation. It wanted something. Not more data. Not more hosts. It wanted activation. And the key, he was beginning to suspect, was sound. He had been studying the symbols etched into the cave wall at Hal Saflieni, recreating their patterns in 3 dimensions, feeding them into acoustic simulation software. When the tones were played back through a precision sound system, a strange thing happened. The DNA samples in his lab reacted. Not just with fluorescence, but with reorientation. The spiral bonds would momentarily unfurl and shift into symmetrical arcs as if the sound was waking them, opening tiny molecular doors that had remained sealed for millennia. And it wasn't just any sound. The frequency was specific. It wasn't mechanical. It was linguistic. Cade cross-referenced ancient phonetic structures, proto-languages, tonal vocabularies, syllabic rhythms from Sumerian to Sanskrit, even lost dialects reconstructed from fragmented scrolls and oral traditions. In all of them, he found a pattern. Certain root sounds carried frequencies that matched the harmonics embedded in the genetic fragment. It was as if the archive had been designed to respond to human voice, but only when shaped by a language close to its origin. Sumerian struck the strongest resonance. He found a chant etched into a clay tablet recovered near Eridu, one of the first Sumerian cities. The symbols were rhythmic, repeating, almost melodic. The phrase translated loosely as, "May that which was placed within be stirred by the voice that remembers." Cade recorded himself reading the chant aloud, carefully replicating its original cadence. Then he played the recording in the chamber with the active DNA. At first, nothing. Then the room vibrated subtly, like air shivering. The DNA strand began to spiral open again. But this time, it didn't stop at geometric unfolding. It began to project light. A faint line of blue energy hovered above the sample. Cade backed away slowly, his breath held. The light shifted, coiling like smoke, then hardening into shape lines, angles, symbols in motion. It wasn't just projection. It was language. Not made by mouth or ink, but by frequency embedded in structure. And Cade could feel it inside his thoughts, like a lucid memory of something he'd never lived. The code had been written not in math, but in spoken form, carried through the body, passed through sound, remembered through vibration. It was a song, built into the species, waiting for a moment in history when the voice that shaped it long ago would finally return to sing it again. And he was not alone in this realization. He contacted the chirophysicist, who had been experimenting with harmonic toning using ancient Egyptian vowels. She had produced similar effects: memory flashes, physical trembling, shifts in perception when chanting particular syllables inside stone chambers. Others from the network reported the same. A monk in Tibet. A linguist in Basque Country. A woman in Papua New Guinea whose tribal dialect included a lullaby containing a repeating tone that matched the archive's bass harmonic exactly. None of them had ever spoken. None of them had ever shared texts. Yet they all reported the same symbol appearing when the sound was sung, a four-pointed spiral, wrapped in light. The archive was remembering its own voice. And through them, it was beginning to speak again. That night, Cade performed a full resonance ritual chanting the Sumerian phrase while holding a sample of his blood under the DNA scope. When the chant ended, the blood had separated. Not in the way cells do, but in structure, like pieces of itself had chosen to stand apart, to be seen. Inside one of the cells, under magnification, was a shifting crystalline signature: small, perfect, impossible. It pulsed, not with light, but with rhythm. And Cade, in a whisper not fully his own, said, "This is their memory, living in our language." He stared into the lens, eyes wide with something between awe and terror. Because if voice could awaken the archive, then language was not something humans developed, it was something humans were given. A gift. A key. A call. And the final part of the message, embedded in sound, etched now into the deepest corner of Cade's mind, was no longer in Sumerian, but in a vibration that felt like memory itself rising from the void. We are returning to the ones who can still hear us. The waveform had become a spiral. Not just in sound. Not just in math. But in behavior. It pulsed now with intention, slow, vast, ancient. Cade could feel it under his skin. Not as sensation, but as a presence. He began dreaming less of places, and more of geometries, floating latticework made of memory, light, sorrow, and time. He would wake whispering numbers, tones, syllables, pieces of something far greater than language, greater than knowledge. The code was almost complete. Across the globe, other carriers of the genetic fragment had begun to synchronize, not through internet, not through technology, but through a resonance Cade now called the field. It wasn't bound by physics. It was older. Pre-quantum. A layer beneath reality where thought and matter still danced as one. He didn't understand it, but he could feel it. And more than that, he could see it. When the 26 base pair was combined with the resonance sequence generated from ancient Sumerian chants, and played through a scalar sound array, something happened. The room dimmed. Shadows pulled toward the speakers. The blood in the samples rose and formed fractal structures, tiny trees made of molecular memory. And in the center of the lab, Cade felt his chest compress, not from pain, but from recognition. As if his body had just received a message it had been waiting its whole life to hear. And then, the code changed. Just slightly. Just once. One harmonic split. A divergence. A reply. It wasn't human. Cade stared at the screen, heart racing, breath slow. The waveform was different. Similar, yes, but older. It carried a signature, one that didn't match his own. He filtered the signal and laid it over Earth's recorded transmissions. No match. He ran it against known SETI anomalies. Nothing. Then he tried something strange. He reversed it. The moment the waveform flipped, the lab reacted violently. All electronics shorted. Every bulb exploded at once. Cade was thrown against the far wall as a pulse of air, not heat, not force, just presence flooded the space. The spiral on his screen now rotated in reverse, but at its center, something new began to emerge, a second layer, like a twin signal. Not from Earth. From outside. And it was already responding. Cade woke up hours later on the floor. Smoke coiled from the damaged equipment. Every screen in the lab now displayed one thing, a countdown. Not from any clock, but from the stars. He realized, then, what the signal truly was. It was a key. But more importantly, it was a request. Thousands of years ago, the archive had been seeded within DNA, within stone, within song. Not as a gift. Not as control. But as a promise. A way back. A path home. And the activation Cade had triggered was not the first. It was a return transmission. The spiral had been sent before from Earth, perhaps by a lost civilization, or a last survivor. And now, it had reached its destination. And they had replied. Cade pulled up the reverse waveform, staring at it, unable to breathe. The data carried a frequency not found in any natural form, dense, layered, impossibly complex. He ran it through bioresonance software. The result stunned him. The signal wasn't a message. It was a profile. A consciousness. The code was alive. And it wanted in. He stumbled toward the emitter array. His hands shook. Not from fear but from awe. He wasn't just sending a signal anymore. He was opening a gate. And the archive was the lock. The countdown continued. 03:12:48. 03:12:47. 3 hours. 3 hours until what? He thought of the glyphs carved in forgotten tombs, the spirals in the desert sand, the songs whispered to sleeping children. All of them carried pieces of this moment. All of them were chapters in a book not written by humans, but written into humans. He looked up at the dark screen, at the pulsing spiral, now glowing faintly. "We are ready," he whispered. And from the darkness, not from the speakers, not from the machines but from the room itself, a voice responded. Not a sound, but a presence. "So are we." It began in the sky. Not a flash. Not a light. But a stillness. The stars stopped twinkling just for a second, like the atmosphere itself had frozen. Across the globe, astronomers noticed a subtle distortion in starlight, like a lens had been placed between Earth and the universe. The distortion followed a pattern, invisible to most, but clear to those attuned to the signal. It pulsed every 8 seconds, soft but undeniable. And then the anomalies began. Birds in flight changed direction all at once, flocks moving not like creatures but like circuits. Herds of animals shifted migration patterns mid-season. Underwater seismic recorders picked up ultra-low frequency hums not from tectonic plates but from the water itself. And across continents, people who had never met, never heard of Cade or the Archive or Lyra, began waking at the same time 03:12 a.m. gasping for air, clutching their chests, whispering words in forgotten tongues. They drew spirals in the dust, sang songs in frequencies they could not explain. And in their blood, the fragment began to glow. The code was awake. In Cade's lab, the countdown neared 0. Every surface hummed. The building itself moaned quietly, not from stress but from resonance. The archived signal, now fully formed, had completed its harmonic cycle. The waveform was no longer data, it was a field. A spatial lattice that extended far beyond walls, reaching across continents, threading itself into ley lines, into magnetic veins of the earth, into bodies that carried the seed. Cade stood at the center of it, the emitter behind him no longer necessary. The signal now radiated from him. From them. Every carrier. Every host. Every human who bore the unchanged genetic code. They were all becoming amplifiers. A global network had ignited, ancient, invisible, and alive. Satellites began malfunctioning. Not from damage, but from overload. Every band, every channel from FM to gamma was being flooded with a low, layered hum, the return code. Governments scrambled to isolate the source. Nothing worked. Every effort to suppress the signal only amplified it. The code wasn't being transmitted. It was emerging from people, from stone, from language, from the earth itself. And then, came the shift. One by one, those connected to the archive began to change. Subtle, at first. Heightened awareness. Pulses in the fingertips. A feeling of something pressing at the back of the mind, not invasive but curious. Empathetic. Cade watched as others reported sudden flashes of memories not their own. A woman in Alaska saw a desert sun she'd never known. A boy in Morocco wept after dreaming of oceans under alien stars. An elderly man in Japan drew perfect schematics of a technology that had never existed. They were remembering not through stories, but through resonance inheritance. Cade named it the awakening field, a living, breathing map of consciousness that had begun to overlay itself on human experience. But there was more. In the atmosphere, high above, weather patterns began to spiral, unnaturally subtle and silent. Not storms, but alignments. The jet stream shifted toward harmonic convergence points. Lightning strikes increased near ancient sites. Atmospheric pressure oscillated in fractal rhythms, recorded only by sensitive instruments. But the message was clear, the planet was responding. Earth had heard the call. And Earth remembered. Then came the first coordinated dream. Hundreds reported it. Then thousands. A cathedral of crystal and wind, standing beneath a dark violet sky, surrounded by tall beings whose skin shimmered like starlight. They stood in a ring around a column of sound, pure, rising, calling not with language, but with belonging. And in the center stood Cade. Not him, but his shape, his voice. His face projected into their minds as a conduit, not of authority, but of alignment. A bridge between the DNA and the design. Cade, overwhelmed, realized the field had chosen him not as leader but as anchor. The countdown reached 0. And the earth didn't shake. It exhaled. All over the planet, those attuned fell into a moment of stillness, eyes open, Heart slowed, breath steady as if some great algorithm had reset itself inside them. The hum faded. The signal softened. And something listened. Beyond Earth. Beyond orbit. Beyond light. The answer had been heard. The signal had stopped. The world had grown quiet in a way Cade had never known. It wasn't silence. It was something deeper, an absence of questioning, as if the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for an answer it already feared. Cade stood in his lab, but it no longer felt like a place of science. The machines were dormant. The lights dimmed. The walls, once sterile, now hummed with memory. He felt it in his bones. The archive was no longer searching. It was remembering. And through him, it would begin to understand. For days, the skies had remained unusually clear. Instruments that once measured wind, light, magnetism now read patterns that had no explanation. There were no more countdowns. No more dreams. Only presence. Everywhere Cade went, he saw signs of awakening, children speaking phrases in dead languages, elders weeping without knowing why, animals gathering in quiet places as if drawn by memory. It was as if the entire earth had shifted one layer closer to the truth, and the truth was not what they had expected. He began reading his own genome again. Not to analyze, but to listen. And buried deep within a cluster of code long dismissed as non-functional, he found a second structure dormant, locked, but beautifully intact. It was shaped like a spiral, nested within a spiral. A mirror. He fed it into the resonance chamber and activated the same frequency from Lyra, but reversed. The reaction was immediate. The lights pulsed. Not in chaos, but in rhythm. A pattern. A countdown, but not to an event. To an answer. The resonance formed into words not spoken, not typed, but delivered into thought, as if Cade's mind had become a page now being read by something older, wiser, but still grieving. You were not born. You were built. You were not built to serve. You were built to remember. He collapsed to his knees. The weight of the message pressed against his chest like gravity inverted. Images flooded him: vast cities made of breathing crystal, stars falling into black seas, hands not human shaping the first cellular strands with tools of light and sound. They hadn't created life from nothing. They had sculpted memory into matter, engineered vessels that could not just think but feel time. And Earth was their garden. But something had gone wrong. He saw flashes of conflict, not war, but divergence. A choice made by those who had been created, to forget. To deny the voice of the archive. To silence the code. And so the makers, tall, radiant, sorrowful, had left, sealing the key in flesh and waiting for it to be remembered, not by command, but by compassion. The answer was not in history books. It was not in religion. It was not in science. It was in pain. In the shared grief of a species searching for meaning. The code had not activated because of technology. It had awakened because enough minds had finally begun to ask the same question: why are we here? And that question had power. Because the answer was not given. It had to be felt. Cade stood, trembling, tears on his cheeks. The lab had vanished from his senses. He now stood beneath a sky that shimmered not with stars, but with memory. And from that memory, a voice rose, not from above, not from beyond, but from within. You are not our children. You are not our slaves. You are our mirror. A mirror. Not to reflect form, but to reflect loss. To remember what they were. What they failed to protect. what they hoped to carry on not through conquest or control, but through love encoded in light. Cade whispered, voice breaking. Then why did we forget? The answer came not in words, but in sorrow. Because remembering hurts. It was no longer about Cade. The archive had grown beyond the vessel. Beyond the lab, beyond even the people who carried it in their blood. It had become a field, an unseen river of memory flowing through the bones of the earth, through the breath of trees, through the heartbeat of mountains. Cade was simply standing in the center of it now. Not to control. Not to lead. But to listen. The resonance no longer needed machines. The code pulsed within the wind. Every element in the world seemed to vibrate with a quiet knowing. Even silence had changed, no longer empty, but sacred, filled with the tension of something immense waiting just at the edge of recognition. He had not slept in days. He no longer needed to. His body remained in the lab, still and warm, but his consciousness had traveled. It floated beyond the skin, following a thread that shimmered like liquid starlight, weaving through layers of thought, emotion, instinct. He passed through the dreams of strangers, the fears of children, the echoes of forgotten languages. And then, somewhere beyond time, he saw it. The first memory. It was not an event. It was not a place. It was a feeling, pure, enormous, and unshaped. It had no beginning. It had no language. But it held the weight of everything that ever came after. It was the first moment of awareness. Not light. Not life. Knowing. A single pulse of presence where nothing had yet begun, but something was already longing. A longing to see. To be seen. To become more than light. More than force. To become us. He felt it rise around him like a tide. There was no form here. Only memory that moved like music. He drifted through it like a child returning home to a place he had never known but always missed. He passed visions too many to count, of worlds long gone, of hands reaching through light to shape thought into form. He saw a civilization not of buildings or tools, but of vibration. They had no faces, no names. Only frequency. They sang reality into being, not to rule it, but to love it. And when they felt their own end approaching, they gathered the essence of everything they had ever been and poured it into the only thing that would last beyond time, biology. Not as survival, but as a gift. Cade stood inside the center of that gift now. The archive wasn't a file. It was a memory seed. The first memory. Not of life, but of loss. Because what they could not carry with them, they hoped we would. Not their technology. Not their power. But their sorrow, their hope, their question. And now, he knew the truth. Humanity had not been created to serve, nor to save, nor to worship. Humanity had been created to remember. To carry forward the first moment of knowing, and to walk through existence asking not how to conquer it but how to feel it deeply enough that nothing would ever be truly lost. Tears fell down Cade's face in the lab. His breath slowed. The resonance faded. He opened his eyes. The world outside was still the same, clouds drifting across blue skies, machines humming softly, distant birds calling to one another in the morning light. But nothing felt the same. Because now, he remembered. And somewhere, far above the atmosphere, beyond light and gravity and distance, a signal whispered across the stars, calm, complete, alive. Not a warning. Not a call for help. But a return. And in its silence, the voice of the Makers spoke one final time. You remembered. That is all we ever asked. So now, the truth is no longer buried in stone or scattered in the stars. It's written in us. The archive has awakened. And what we choose to do with it will shape everything that comes next. If you were Cade, and discovered a message inside your DNA, would you follow it? Would you open the gate? Or would you fear what might answer back? Tell us in the comments. DNA, what part of this story resonated with you most? Milky Way, what would you do if you were chosen to carry a memory older than time itself? And what if this story wasn't fiction? Follow us for more stories like this where mystery meets memory, and the stars might be watching. Subscribe to the Alien Storyverse, where every story is a signal, and every signal might be the beginning of something more.